Hey, Tori, can you hear me?
I can. Sorry, you were muted.
I still had the few of the difficulties, but hey, what's up? Good, long time no see.
Yes, thank you for joining us.
Of
Hopefully
course.
that wasn't too hard to get you in there. It looks like we have some people logging in. We'll probably have a few more joining, but I think we can go ahead and get started. First,
Okay.
I'd like to welcome everyone for joining us for another Candid Conversations. This is our sixth week, and we are so fortunate to have Jessica as a part of today's session. My name is Tori, part of Outspoken Agency, and we are a speaking agency based in New York City. And our job is to connect our speakers, just like Jessica, with various event planners and event hosts throughout the world. They speak at conferences, colleges, business meetings, all kinds of events and fundraisers. And we are so fortunate to represent people just like Jessica. And because of the pandemic, we've had a little bit of break in our normal work schedule. We're not able to have our speakers out at events. So we thought this would be a great time to allow them to connect with our hosts, to provide a little bit of expertise in this time of need and a little bit of time of disconnection so that we can just kind of stay connected virtually. So we're really excited to have you all joining. We'll be doing this every Thursday. So first of all, I'd love to let everybody know a little bit more about you, Jessica, and then we'll just dive right in and allow you to give us a little bit more background. For those of you who are not familiar with Jessica or need a little reminder, Jessica is the founder and CEO of Uncharted Power, and they are an award-winning power and data infrastructure technology company that develops infrastructure solutions for communities, facilities, and Internet of Things. And Jessica has received numerous awards and accolades. A few of those include Fortune's Most Promising Women Entrepreneurs, Forbes 30 Under 30 list, Inc. 30 Under 30, and Scientist of the Year by Harvard University, which seems like a huge honor. And most recently, you welcomed sports legend Magic Johnson to your board of directors, which is so exciting. So yeah, Jessica, I'd love for you just to give us a little bit more background that you'd love to about your journey with Uncharted Power, becoming an entrepreneur, and anything exciting that you've been looking forward to recently.
Oh gosh. Well, the journey's been long, right? So this will be a long setup, right? I'm 32 now, and in some ways, this journey for me started very much at the very least from when I was 19. But I think to a certain extent, it's been, in my opinion, a lifelong journey. And I want to say thank you for giving me a chance to speak and to connect with people during this time. It is a very weird time, right?
Yeah.
It's a time when I think people are balancing surviving, but also not wanting to miss out on an opportunity to thrive, right? And figuring out that balance and that sustainability can be tough. And I think for me, I've been lucky in that since I've been doing this for so long, I've had to figure out that balance, right? Because there's the concept of just surviving when you're just growing up or when you're trying to figure out what you want to do, figure out what makes sense for you, but then also trying to pick up on very specific points in your life, very specific observations and moments when you aren't going to just accept the status quo, and you're going to actually say, actually, I think there could be better. Like, I think life could be better. And I want to try something. Little old me, right? I want to try something. And that's, I think, very much been, I guess to a certain extent, like the theme for me, right? My story, I guess, to a certain extent starts, why don't we go ahead and start it at the age of 17, even though I have to tell you, like, I've always been someone who's loved to tinker, loved to experiment from like a very young age. I like to tell people that I'm the love child of Beyonce and Bill Nye the Science Guy, like in everything that I do, because from a very, very young age, I was way more Bill Nye, to be honest, from a really young age. But I've always loved the idea of using science to make magic real. Like to the point where I literally believed in the tooth fairy up until the age of 12, because I decided that there was a scientific way for it to be possible, right? And so I think for me, that's always been something that I've been able to look to, something I've been able to lean on, to try to create the world that I wanted. And so when I was 17, no longer believing in the tooth fairy, but still to a certain extent believing in agency and the ability to have the power to change our world, right? I found myself in Nigeria. So I'm actually a dual citizen of Nigeria, the United States. And most of my family lives in Nigeria. My father, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins. And so I spent a lot of time growing up, going back and forth between upstate New York and Nigeria. And one of the first things you'll notice when you go to almost any country in the developing world, even though increasingly so it's becoming an issue here in the United States as well, is that you have an issue with access to clean, reliable power, right? And it's a issue that's infrastructural, right? Like people actually they're actually paying, I would say, almost twice as what we're paying right now per kilowatt hour, right? In places like Nigeria. But they're paying for kerosene lamps. They're paying for a bit of diesel oil, right, for their generator. They don't have the ability to pay into a system to get the power and the kind of things that we have come to expect in the United States and other developed countries. And so it's an infrastructural issue that masquerades as a socioeconomic issue, but nonetheless, like it's still this massive, pervasive issue. And so whether I would be in the city with my cousins or in the village, you know, with my grandparents, we would expect to lose power every single day, like clockwork, multiple times a day. And you just kind of get used to it. Which never sat well with me. But in particular, when I was 17, I was in Nigeria for my aunt's wedding, and we lost power as expected. And this time, instead of just kind of dealing with it, we had to bring in a diesel generator inside of the home to just kind of keep the festivities going. And for me, this seemed horrible. The fumes were so bad. I found myself like struggling to breathe, and other people were having some difficulties too. And so I remember going to my cousins who were in their 20s at the time, you know, one or two of them actually who became engineers, and complaining, right? And that's usually what I do first and foremost. When I think something doesn't make sense, when I think that something's very uncomfortable, I start to complain, right? Not right, it's a cathartic thing. And it was what they said that I think launched me into my career to a certain extent, or at least it was the first part of what launched me. They said the same thing that I had mentioned earlier. They said, "Don't worry, you'll get used to it." And I remember really thinking, okay, we are sitting in this room breathing in fumes that are killing us. We know that a kerosene lamp, burning oil in a kerosene lamp, is like smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. We know this is horrible for the environment. We know this is horrible for the people living in this room. So what you're telling me then is that the best way to solve my problem is to pretend like there is no problem. And then that means you're essentially telling me to just get used to dying, right? Much sooner than I technically should, right? And feeling no agency. And I think what saddened me even more, though, was that my cousins, right, men in Nigeria who should have the world as kind of their oyster, right, should see all this opportunity, they essentially had gotten used to dying, right? They couldn't imagine any innovation, any public-private partnership, anything that could change the status quo. And that's what didn't really sit well with me. At the time, I didn't know what to do with it. You know, came back from the summer time in Nigeria and back in school in the United States for my senior year of high school. And it stayed with me kind of in the back of my mind. But a few things happened over the course of that 12 to 15 month period as I was leaving high school and going into college that then ended up really cementing my belief that I had to do something. I had to try to solve, or at least attempt to address the problem, right? And so during that time, my uncle, my aunt, who's actually was younger than I am right now, and my grandfather all passed away. And they all passed away from things that either could have been delayed or avoided if they lived in a place that had infrastructure. And I remember not only just seeing the sadness, you know, in my family and dealing with so much loss in one period of time, but I remember thinking, I wonder if on their last day, they felt the same way my cousins do. They felt like, well, this is it. What can you do? Why fight? What's the purpose? And I think that's, again, is like, that was what didn't sit well with me, right? Maybe we can't cure death, but we for damn sure should be able to cure the way you feel at that moment, like in terms of feeling like you've lived a full life, feeling like you had some sort of power to change the world around you. And so not too much longer later, I'm taking a class in undergrad called Idea Translation, Affecting Change Through Art and Science. And in my mind, I'm like, okay, I'm not an artist. Like I can't sing, I can dance pretty well, but like I can't like draw, like, I don't know, right? Like, and at the time I also didn't think I was a scientist, even though, you know, if you actually look at the definition of science, it's the study of life. And so if you're living, you're actually halfway there. But in my mind, I was like, okay, let me try. What do I have? I have my observations. I have this thing that I know I want to address. So how do I think about that, right? Let's see what I can do. And that's what led to me taking a class and coming up with something that would be what I felt was like something that would bridge the gap, right? So I thought back to my time in Nigeria, and I was like, okay, the only time I saw my cousins and my family members, like one of the few times I saw them really showing passion and excitement and feeling like they had power to change their status quo, was when they were playing soccer, right? Like when they were playing. And, you know, that was the time when, you know, I have some cousins who are very much just like average at sports, like nothing special at all. But, you know, when they were playing soccer, that's when they'll be making the bets. Like, oh, I bet you I can do this thing that Pele did, or I could do this thing that Beckham did. And 9 out of 10 times they did not do the trick. They did not make it, right? But 1 out of every 10 times they did. And that's what I wanted to bottle. That's what I wanted to capture, because the real issue, the real disaster, in my opinion, was no one's even trying to get this agency back, to change the world, to innovate, right? And try to make something better. And so I thought, okay, well, I understood kind of kinetic energy and the energy of motion from high school physics. And the concept of creating something that would bridge that gap between where people already have this passion and this excitement, and how do we bring that off the pitch or off the field to life, right? Was where the first invention came from. And so when I was 19, I invented an energy generating soccer ball that could actually harness the energy from play and store that power inside of the ball, so it could be used as a simple off-grid power source, something that you could play with and get a little bit of light. You know, an hour of play would give you 3 hours of light. And the idea wasn't that it would solve all of the infrastructural energy problems by any means, right? But I thought that it would be an example of what was possible, right? An example of energy that would be closer to home, energy that we had power over, energy that we could influence, you know, and something that made people like my cousins realize that they could be part of the movement, that they could actually make a difference. What I didn't expect was that this would be the thing that, I guess what I didn't expect was that this would be the thing that changed me more than even the whole audience that I was creating the product for, in a certain way. Like
I mean, you were a psychology major, right?
Yeah, like I studied psychology and economics, right? Like I literally tell people I have a PhD in Google, because I Googled a lot, right? Like a lot to figure this out, and I still do. But what it ended up doing was, you know, giving me something that I thought was lucky, right? So I told people that luck is an acronym. In my opinion, it stands for laboring under correct knowledge. And when I had this idea and I had this thing that was lucky, here's a one right here. During these times, you'd be surprised at how helpful it is to have energy generating things just around. No,
yeah.
You know, but it was one of those things where I was like, okay, this seems to be speaking to people. This seems to make sense. Let me go deeper in this. Now I'm in this scary world of energy, but I came in through play. And I've created something that at least is showing people that there could be more. And then from there, you know, so that happened when I was 19, 20, 21, 22, really taking the time to understand supply chain and understand all the things that can make it hard to perhaps create something. But it's not that hard. It's the one thing I want to say. So people shouldn't be afraid to try. And I ended up building a company that first started making energy generating play products for developing communities. We ended up then broadening that and realizing that the same technology we put inside of these soccer balls and energy generating jump ropes, they can go inside of everything that moves. And we started working with different Fortune 100s on how to design these micro generation technologies for their different products, from strollers to cricket balls to you have everything in the middle. And, you know, it even came to the point where we realized that we'd actually have to start creating IP, not just on the generation side of things, but thinking about energy transmission and energy storage. And the result, it essentially resulted in us building a company that had created almost like an alternative ecosystem for how energy should work, all starting from a soccer ball. And about 3 years ago, you know, I should say about 4 years ago, you know, we're doing this work, but we're still not solving the big infrastructural problem. But now we're getting close enough to realize that maybe this isn't just about inspiring other people to do it, that maybe we as this team of people, you know, we're based in Harlem, very diverse team, very young team, maybe we're the ones, right? Maybe that would actually have to change things in a big way. And so we spent the majority of 2017 transferring all of our IP to be relevant on an infrastructure level. Started developing things like energy generating speed bumps, and then really saw that there was a massive issue with the way we transmit energy. That's actually the big problem. You think about the fires in California with PG&E, when each time it's just a little bit of wind, you lose power. It's almost like no matter how cool the car that you build, right? Whether it's kinetic energy or it's solar or it's wind or it's biofuels, all of those things, if the way that you transmit that energy, right? The road that car is going to drive on either doesn't exist, like in the developing world, there's barely any legitimate transmission cables for power, or it does exist, but it hasn't been upgraded in like 70 to 150 years old, like what you have going on in a lot of places in the world. Then no matter what, that car's not going to go that far. It's not going to do what you need it to do. And so we really focused in on that and said, okay, this is the thing. We need to rebuild the grid. We need to rebuild the way we get our power and think about power access. And that's what we started to push on. And so now, you know, we're in a really exciting place. We've developed this new grid resiliency technology that's like the smartphone for infrastructure development. It can do so much more than just transmit power. We are really lucky to have people like Magic Johnson on our board, Disney as investors, and we've been actually developing a smart city project here in the US to show everyone what's possible, and then actually work with partners to bring it to the developing world and bring it to Nigeria and all the places that need it. And so that is how I started with a class project and a trip to Nigeria and an invention of a soccer ball, and came to the point where now we have an award-winning infrastructure technology company that is doing more than I could have ever even dreamed, to be honest.
Such a fascinating story. Obviously, I'm very familiar with your journey, but I mean, there are so many ways that you could think of correlations with what we're dealing with now and how students and educators can utilize this time and find agency and inspire and create maybe the new soccer ball of COVID-19, you know what I mean? Using that as the example, but, you know, creating something that becomes revolutionary or very unique in its own right in the healthcare system.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think, you know, it's tough because part of it is actually taking a moment to step away from what's going on, to actually have that, that glimpse of things, right? Like I think to a certain extent, the privilege that I had, and I do actually believe that it was a privilege, is that I had the juxtaposition of traveling to Nigeria and being in this situation and sitting there with my family and saying, we don't have power, we don't have the appropriate infrastructure, and then flying back to the US and seeing what that could look like. So it was a little bit harder for me to accept. Whereas right now, you know, in our current situations, I think a lot of us feel trapped. We don't really have an escape. And I think the key there, at least what I've been really doing with my team, is to think about creating moments for distraction, right? Like everyone's trying to think through, oh, what's the best thing to invest in? And what's the best thing to do this or that? Sometimes I think the first thing is spiritual investments. What do you need to do to find balance and remove yourself away from everything that's going on for a bit? Whether it's meditation, whether it's going for a walk, whether it's watching just a really funny movie, right? And watching a series of really funny movies, and documentaries or whatever. Like the idea is to try to kind of step away from a moment, from the news and what's going on, and then find that when you return, I think you have a refreshed way of looking at things. And then I also think that what was helpful for me is that I didn't go into it saying, I'm going to solve the energy problems of the world. Now, we as a company are like, we are going to solve the energy problems of the world, but that was so overwhelming and way too much. It started with a little idea. The first prototype of the socket was a shake to charge flashlight and a hamster wheel, like a hamster wheel ball. Right, and we just put them inside of each other. We just put the shake to charge flashlight inside of the hamster ball and rolled it on the ground. And we were like, okay, conceptually, this suggests that you can have smaller generation mechanisms inside of a ball, and when you play with it, it will generate power, right? And then you build from there, and you build from there, and you know, for back then it was going to Dwayne Reed, our local drugstore and Target, and taking things apart and putting it together. Now maybe it's ordering things on Amazon, taking them apart, putting them together, not being afraid to break things, you know. I think sometimes the biggest way to think big is to think small. And right now, the key thing is, if you have an idea, if you think something's kind of cool, to build out some time and try it out. Right? And don't put this big magnanimous thing, like if I do this, it must be this. It's like, and you try it out for an afternoon. If you like it and it seems to make sense, it's like, then you keep working on it, right? It's definitely a marathon.
Yeah, and we certainly all have the time to spare right now, so we can all use a little time to pause and innovate. I wanted to just make sure everyone knows there is a Q&A box that you can submit questions for Jessica. We'll try to get to as many as possible. You can also submit those in the chat box as well. We'd love to see what you'd like to ask Jessica. We did have some pre-submitted, and I do want to touch on one in particular, just while we've covered your story. This is from Gift, and the question is, as a young inventor, how did you get over some of that skepticism from, and maybe how are you doing that now that you're tackling infrastructure with the energy system, in terms of people and your idea? How did you deal with that?
Skepticism. I mean, in a weird way, the best ideas should be a little bit controversial, right? Like I remember when we were first even just thinking initially about the socket idea, right? Like the kind of group of us that were in the class together, and there were actual like rocket scientists who played soccer who were like, it's just not possible. And we were like, are you sure? And they're like, it's just not possible. You'll never generate enough power. And it was one of those things where it's like, wait, but we're not talking about powering a room. Like we're talking about something so small, just a little bit of light. And it was almost like they didn't understand the problem. They didn't understand the solution. They didn't understand what we were actually trying to address, you know? And so, you know, I think the key thing is to not let someone's feedback, right? Or what someone is saying to you, like, necessarily be the thing that drives why you're even starting this. Some people will get it, some people won't. And that's okay, right? I think obviously if you say something and nobody gets it, like everyone's just like, that's the worst idea. I'm not even saying then that you should get rid of that idea, but you might want to, you might want to prototype it personally a little bit and understand what's going on. For me, it was really about putting the test barriers or the standards out myself. So for like the first thing I wanted to see was that kind of really, really rough proof of concept, right? So, okay, the shake the charge flashlight and the hamster wheel. And I remember rolling it, in the dorm room, back and forth, and then pulling out the shake the charge flashlight and turning it on and saying, so now I know this works, right? And so I think you should be looking less at what people who are fallible think, looking at more, how can you prove things to yourself, right? What little small tests can you do to prove things to yourself? And the key is to break things down to its simplest form, which can be really hard, really, 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 really hard. But try to strip it down to its simplest thing and then say, okay, that's the thing that I need to prove to myself first. And then you could look at efficiency, and then you could look at cost, and then you can look at durability. You can look at all these different things, but like the first thing is functionally, does this make sense? And that's, of course, if you're inventing a thing. If it's a system or something else, it's a little bit more complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to get in a little bit of talking about infrastructure issues that we've kind of seen unfold during the pandemic, and they've come in different ways in different areas. But in particular, I know we have some educators here today watching, and I know that there have been some obvious infrastructure issues surrounding how the education system has operated remotely while we're physically distanced. We're not able to be in school, whether that's K through 12 or universities, some people being from more rural areas and not having access to everything. Is there something that Uncharted Power does, part of your infrastructure system, your energy generating systems, that could have possibly served to change or improve these underserved areas?
Definitely. And I think that's what makes what we're doing right now really exciting, because we've always felt that decentralized infrastructure was the future, right? So we've come from a world where everything's been very centralized. We have these massive power generation plants, and then we have transmission lines that kind of flow down almost like a waterfall till it gets to your house. And sometimes those transmission lines can be hundreds of miles away, right? Like between the generation point and your home. And what we're kind of suggesting is a more decentralized approach, right? Where instead of having one massive power generation plant, you have, homes that have solar on them. You have small windmills. You have energy generating speed bumps. You have all of these things more in a local community or city. And then you have essentially these different sites sharing power as power is needed in different places. So it's a much more dynamic but also kind of like democratic way of thinking about power sharing. But it also means that you have a bit more resiliency in the system. So if something happens in one place, the other things can still work, right? Because you have power coming from different places. In the new system that we've been developing, that we're actually piloting now, it's called the Uncharted system. There might be a better name that comes out, but right now we call it system because we're easy. And the idea there is to build a system that allows us to essentially decentralize the grid, right? And modularize it. And in doing that, we're also decentralizing technologies that need the power, particularly connectivity technologies. So in each of the panels that we put in the ground, to just give you kind of a framework, essentially the Uncharted system is a paver. It can look like road, it can look like sidewalk, it can look like anything. When you install it in the ground, you now have this tech-ready place that you can put all of these power and IoT and connectivity technologies safely in the ground in local communities versus far out, right? So now when you put these things in the ground, you're able to decentralize your fiber optic. You're able to put 5G antennas in the ground to boost the signals and actually have that ability. You're able to put decentralized data center hardware in the ground, and it has direct connectivity to power, to Ethernet, and all of that. It creates this safe space with power to put all of the technology we need in the ground in our local communities. And by doing that, you now improve all of the infrastructure that we're using so much more right now. So you'll find that you'll have faster speeds for going online, for doing video calls, for downloading things. All of that is faster because we brought the infrastructure closer to your home versus the time it would take for it to kind of interact and go to the cloud in a much more centralized system. And so something we didn't really notice as much when we were more in person. But now the little things like not having a data center nearby a community actually is what's affecting our ability to do more with the internet. And so there's a lot I can go into there technically to really explain all of that, but I'll leave it at that to just say, yes, what we're building is designed to decentralize infrastructure and bring it into communities so you can actually have renewable energy within the communities, shared and generated and all of that. And you can also have all the things that the renewable energy would power now much more local and actually built into the environment within the community.
Yeah, that's amazing. Have you found that, I know you've been working on a lot of this for the last few years, this kind of transition and business focus. Have you found that right now everything that's happened has kind of reinforced your change, or has it made you kind of alter or second guess some of those plans?
It's reinforced it, I would say, because again, we're seeing, I think the biggest issue sometimes when it comes to change in general is that things can either be important, urgent, or both. And often the things that actually get attention are the things that are urgent or urgent and important. And renewable energy, sustainability, rebuilding infrastructure so that it can actually last, so that it can serve people in residential communities just as much as it's serving the commercial, fancy cities. All of that has been important, but it wasn't urgent until now. Now we're seeing the problem where someone says, I only have internet if I go to school. I only have reliable internet if I go to work, right? And the main reason why it's difficult to bring that type of ICT, telco infrastructure into residential communities is really, I would say, two things. One is because actually thinking through the power access, the power distribution to those technologies is very difficult. It's one thing to have a sensor or have some cool hardware, but if you don't really have a place to put it and a way for it to get power, you have a problem. And then the second is that when you think about the actual location of these technologies, there's only so many things you can put in streetlights and different poles and things like that. There needs to be a cost-effective way for us to build these things in the ground. And until our system, it was really, really expensive just to run normal power cabling in the ground, to say the least of putting anything else in the ground. And so that's why we're really excited about what we've built. The analogy that I've used before, that we're building this like smartphone for infrastructure development. It stands because I think in many ways the smartphone was also a very democratizing innovation, right? And initially smartphones were created for the basic purpose of just making phone calls more convenient. In the same way that we created our system initially for the main purpose of making power access more convenient. How do we actually build these microgrids and bring power in a more convenient way to these communities, bring renewable, clean power to these communities? But what ended up happening is that by developing this system, we actually created something that allows us to also host apps, right? So we can now host things like 5G antennas and these data center hardware and sensors and all of that in our panels in the ground, providing almost like an operating system for all of these technologies that can now provide services to the communities as well. And we can upgrade them in a cost-effective way. which is why some people can still have an iPhone 7 and be just fine because they can upgrade their apps. We can do the same thing. And so believe it or not, when it comes to infrastructure, this idea of convenience and upgradability and modularity just didn't exist. And so it became this thing where only the people with the most money and with the, the most influence got the best technology. And we never thought that was fair at Uncharted Power. We that was something I knew was an issue all the way back when I was in Nigeria when I was 17. And we're really, really excited that what we've been building for 3 years, what we're now piloting like now, right? Like, it's not like, oh no, we now know there's an issue, let's spend 7 years developing the tech. We've been in it. And we're really excited to make a few announcements over the next couple of months to show what we're doing as an organization to develop technology that will, again, give people agency and make people feel like they can actually grab hold of this crazy world and start to shape it in the way that makes sense for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that we definitely need those things right now. I wanted to ask you, I was reading an article through MIT's Tech Review about how COVID-19 has kind of blown apart this myth of Silicon Valley innovation, which I thought was really interesting. I know in comparison, you've always talked about how you wanted to create the new Silicon Valley, right, in Harlem. So I thought it'd be interesting to hear what you thought might be some good lessons that we've kind of learned from these inefficiencies that have been exposed about, the American way of innovation, new ideas, and how technology and our manufacturing structure has kind of inhibited our access to these products and protections and kind of basic needs that we've decided have been most important to us during this pandemic.
Yeah, I definitely believe that innovation kind of lives between a rock and a hard place. And so, ultimately, when you think about entrepreneurship, which is essentially just trying to actually scale your innovation, it's problem solving without regard for resource. And so if you have a problem and you find yourself between a rock and a hard place, then you will innovate. You will come up with this new thing. But that's a very specific setup. That's a very specific context. And to a certain extent, I don't want to speak too broadly about, everyone in Silicon Valley, but to a certain extent, I think, if you're living within a bubble where your problems aren't necessarily reflective of the problems or the realities of people around the world or just even outside of that region, you're not really put in the best position then to innovate for the world. And part of why we built our company in Harlem was because we thought it was truly a privilege to be able to, just from the minute when we walked off the subway, which no one's walking on for any time, you would see your rabbi on 96th Street. You would see your barber on 125th. You'd see your teachers on 145th. There's little Senegal on 116th. Like, you see a microcosm of the world right in front of you. And it reminds you of the problems of the world, right? And I remember that would happen sometimes, when we'd be kind of getting into this, startup-y problem space, and then we'd see something that was so real, right? Or even just the fact that, the line for the food bank is now rounding the corner. And if you walk out just to take a walk during this whole pandemic, you will see that line get longer and longer and longer. If you live and work in a place where you don't see those things, how do you solve that problem? How do you even know there's a problem to solve? How does it feel real? So I think, for me now, it's no longer even just about creating, the next Silicon Valley in Harlem. It's about creating the next Silicon Valley in our homes and in our hearts and our minds. Because this is no longer about where you live. This is about what you choose to have empathy for, not just sympathy, but empathy for, and actually put yourself in these positions and then say, I want to solve these real problems. And the most authentic way to do that is to look to the people who are already experiencing these problems, right? Not to kind of fabricate some sort of connection, but for everyone to lean into their own intersectionality in this, right? Like, as a woman, you should feel some sort of empathy for the fact that the majority of essential workers are actually women, right? For me, as an African-American person, I'm sitting here thinking and looking at the number of essential workers, the number of people who are dying who look just like me. As a small business owner, I'm feeling for the people with small businesses that are trying to figure out how they come through this. Now's the time not to pretend like we're not all these things. It's actually the time to really lean in to that and feel the pain and understand the problem. And then that's what the root of the next kind of innovation community, that's what it's going to be, right? It's going to be people who have decided that they're not just going to get used to it, right? But first and foremost, you actually have to have the problem in front of you, you know? And so in a weird way, I think it is an opportunity. It's a competitive advantage for those who have that intersectionality, who have that feeling, way more than people who are very comfortable right now. The people who are very, very comfortable right now have no actual impetus or reason to build, to make things better. They're noticing that, you know, groceries are now significantly more expensive. If you don't really notice what the cost of milk is, you're not going to think about innovating around that. So there's an opportunity for those who are feeling the pain here more, obviously, if they can be in a position where they can stabilize and start to give themselves that space to think in that way.
Right. Yeah. You know, with those categories of people, in particular, people of color and women, you know, I'm reading a lot of investors or entrepreneurs say, now is the time to launch a new business. Now is the time when you should go for this. And I'm wondering, what do you think about that? When we've already seen limited access to capital, we're dealing with all these issues with PPP and EIDL, and should we be seeking out funding? Should we find this time to innovate and then go ahead and launch in all of this?
I don't know. I mean, girl, if I can tell you my PPP story, I really like if you're not like a large company, you need to work with, let me not say too much because this is funding is not readily available, and people are that much more less likely to back things that are uncertain, things that are unproven. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't try something, but I don't think this is the time to like quit your job. You know, this is definitely the time to figure out that side hustle, but you have to be dedicated to the work that's stable. I would say, you know, people are trying to equate this to past like tragedies that affected people economically and physically, like
2008.
2008. People are trying to compare this to like Sandy or different hurricanes, you know, but this is very different. The last time this happened was 100 years ago, right? This is a very different thing, and I think we need to be honest about that, and we need to acknowledge that. And so the ability to predict the future on this it's going to be different for anyone alive to do, right? I think this is the time to have grace for yourself. This is the time to make sure that you are always in a position where you have enough kind of intellectual capacity and space to take the time to make sure you're okay. To make sure you're okay spiritually, to make sure you're healthy, make sure you're okay emotionally, physically. All those things matter, because if you are going to launch something, the foundation that you build that upon, that's what you are. If you're a frantic mess, this is not going anywhere. Your business isn't going anywhere, nothing's going anywhere. So now is the time to definitely look at stabilizing that, stabilize yourself to a certain extent. And then I would say, once you feel like you're never going to have it perfectly, but once you feel like you're in a position where you have at least dedicated some time to consistently work on that, I think now is the time to think more like from a perspective of ideas. Let's even take away the whole business part of it. Like let's make it youthful and fun, right? Like now is the time to be creative, whether it's painting or writing or singing or picking up something or playing around with things on your mind. Great, run with it, right? And if one actually stays with you and sticks with you and you're like, this is dope. If it's something that you could scale to reach people, I think you start to go the next step and you take it step by step. And the key thing is, again, just to take it step by step. If you find then that there's an opportunity to actually build something that people will spend money on right now, your best bet would probably be to do things in the form of like pre-orders, or do things in the form of kind of almost like funding through your future or potential customers, right? Saying, I have something that I know you want, will you contribute some funding? I think that that kind of not having that pressure, but then when the opportunity shows itself, that's probably the best test, the best litmus test, because if people will pay you something right now, that proves your product market fit, and it gives you a very clear understanding of just how real what you're working on like is, right? If you attempt to go to, first of all, find the funds that are still giving up funding and build some sort of connection, and then you have to make sure that they really believe in what you're doing. I mean, there's an opportunity there for sure, but there were already all these barriers if you weren't a certain type of person in doing that. And those barriers actually they're even more now. They're even tougher now. And so I don't think this is the time that someone says, I'm going to have an idea and then go and just pitch it to 20 people and expect to get the funding for it. This is a time when you're going to have shown a lot more progress, a lot more traction anyway. And so I think it's really about being steady and being very intentional with what you're trying to do, making sure that, again, first and foremost, your foundation is there.
That's great advice. Yeah. One of the audience questions that came up really is a good segue. Maybe now is not the time for seeking out financial assistance to launch, but maybe it's a great time for mentorship. And so Mark is asking, what role did mentorship play in shaping your thinking, and how would you advise young entrepreneurs to go seek out mentors? And especially now, how do you seek those out?
Mentorship, is critical, but I also think that you get mentorship from different people and different interactions, right? Like, I've never met Michelle Obama, but I consider her one of my mentors because of her existence. Yeah, just because she was just out there. She was 20 to 28 when I was coming of age. My first lady was a tall Black woman like me who had strong arms and was just dope and smart. And because she existed, it created space for me to be me and who I am, right? And I think beyond that, there are a lot of advisors that we've brought on at our company. And the key thing there is that we never, ever go to someone and say, hey, please just give us your time, right? Because time is actually the most valuable thing that anyone has. So we give people actual equity in our company. We have an amazing, amazing, brilliant advisory board of individuals that hail from so many different areas and different experiences. They're all luminaries in their field, in my opinion. And we say, like, we value your time so much, and I personally appreciate and know that your time will be so influential in the growth of our business and my growth as a CEO. I want to make sure you have a piece of that. I want to make sure that when we win, you win too. And so, that's really important, because it also means you have to think about who you're asking to be your advisor, and to engage with and make sure they're the right fit. But then in doing that, now they have skin in the game. Now they care. And I think right now that's actually really important. I think there are some people who might have a bit more time, but believe it or not, I actually know most people I know, including myself and my team, we're even busier, right? Because you feel just like you have nothing else to do but work. You feel this pressure to say, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, so I have to work. And, if you're really being careful with how you spend the time you have, because of all this uncertainty. And so I think the first thing is, don't look for one kind of one all be all mentor. There's lots of different mentors. And two, if you have something that you've already started to work on and build, consider taking a small amount of equity. It doesn't have to be a lot. Taking a small amount of equity and saving that as like a pool to compensate an advisory board, right? And give people a bit of skin in the game on what you're doing. It has been probably the number one thing we've done over the last 3 to 4 years to get the company from where it was to where it is today, 100%. And so I think that that's really huge as well. And don't be afraid to have mentors that don't, just because of their existence too, right? Like, and just let yourself be inspired in all those different ways.
Yeah, sometimes it's nice just to have another person who has no skin in the game to bounce ideas off for another perspective, right? It's really helpful.
Yes, yeah, because you have to think too, like I think about some of our advisors and mentors, they also have families and stresses and things, right? And they're trying to, everyone has felt the impact of this. And so, and everything we're doing, we're really saying, we hope this is almost like an outlet for you as well, that this is something that makes you feel like you have some power and some agency. And it's worked out really, really well. We've had way more engagement actually from our advisors recently because at least
That's great.
than otherwise.
That's so great. Yeah, we all have a little bit more time, and I think we're, for the most part, I know for us, a little bit more passionate about how do we not fix it, but figure this out in the interim, and how do we make it better once we come out of this for ourselves and for others. Yeah. Are there any particular coping strategies or preservation practices that you've been doing, not only, just as a person, but also as a founder of a business? How are you balancing that for yourself?
I mean, there's always something new, right? So definitely trying to moving helps, right? Like working out helps. It's hard to do it as much as I did it before, because some days you just feel like there's so much to do, but that definitely really helps. I think taking the time to just kind of not work sometimes is really good. So having a bit of setting boundaries and saying, okay, after this hour, we're going to pause, we're going to watch some TV, we're going to try to do something, garden, whatever. Meditation has been a big one too. You may feel like nothing's happening when you're meditating. I really like the Headspace app. And sometimes I'm like, am I doing what they want me to do? But just that time that you take really, really matters. Like when I can, I try to meditate for about 20 minutes. I usually get that in. Some weeks are great. I do it for like all 7 days. Other times it's only about 3-4 times that week, but that's huge. I think it's important to connect with people you love as well, right? And talk to them more and try to do those things, try to find the things that are fun for you. But I think it's very interesting, especially in New York City, because New York especially feels like, okay, part of the reason why you live here is for all the things that are very Corona friendly. Like it's just like the situation. And so you really have to kind of find new things to enjoy and to get into and to build. And so one thing that I never thought I'd be into ever is like taking walks. Like I'm like the person who likes to box, I'll jump rope, and I still do all those things and lift weights. But I went on my first, I went like on a walk this weekend. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. And then I went on one yesterday, like a little bit of a speedy Oprah walk. And I like in my mind, I was like, oh, this is not good. And I was like sweating a little bit. And like, I woke up and I was a little sore in different places. And I was like, oh, okay. And so now it's like, if you can find a place where you can be safe and properly socially distanced, I'm like, oh, walking. Like, who would have thought, which seems ridiculous. This is actually quite nice. And so I think there are little things. One thing I would definitely say also is really important. Be honest about how you're feeling. This morning, so for my team, we have a scrum, which is like a short meeting where everyone says what they're going to do. We have one every morning and every evening as a kind of bookends for the day. You say what you're going to do, and at the end of the day, you say what you did. And today I started the scrum with just an open-ended, how's everyone feeling? Because it's been over 2 months since we've been working from home. How's everyone feeling? And it ended up being a 40-minute conversation where we were all sharing that for some odd reason, it's like you get situated, then you get really productive. And over the last maybe week or so, we've all been feeling a little bit like, this sucks, like tired, we don't know why. We're not sure if it's cabin fever. We're not sure what we missed. And we're not entirely sure what feels off, but we feel off. And we just talking about it and knowing that we're not crazy. And I think having a chance to talk about it at work, right? That helped, right? And that's the fact. Pretending like you have it all figured out, pretending like, oh, I'm working out, like that's not real, right? Like being honest and knowing that some days are going to be good, some days aren't, but they're always going to be better if you speak about them and you can speak to someone about them. That's probably the number one way to cope, right? And that's the most consistent thing that you can do throughout all of this is speak out how you're feeling. And who knows, maybe that conversation will lead to an idea, which will lead to a prototype, which will lead to a multi-billion-dollar business. And you're welcome. There you go.
That would be amazing. Yeah, but I really hope, I know that you and I are both in smaller businesses, and there's always that closeness with teams, but I hope for other people in other larger organizations, they're kind of feeling like a little bit of humanity has been brought back to the workplace and connection, even though we're physically distant. That's so important to small businesses and how we operate and connect with each other. So hopefully that's something that larger businesses are able to experience as well right now.
I hope so. I'm not sure. Yeah. I know a few people who work for larger companies, and it's not. Sometimes I'm just like, what is the strategy? Why would they tell you that? Why would they tell you that they're forcing you to go back to work?
Yeah.
That's really, so there's some scary things that are happening. And, even in those larger companies, I hope people are taking the time to almost create their own groups and talk to their coworkers, even if it's not being something that's kind of created from the top.
Yeah. And I guess that's a smaller business owners and employees can kind of be sounding boards and support systems for our friends who don't really have that control in those situations. Yeah. Well, it looks like we are out of time. I'm sorry we did not get to all the questions, but this has been such a nice, thoughtful conversation, and we really appreciate you sharing so much of your advice and being very candid in what you're going through. I hope that this is helpful for others.
No problem. Thank you for having me. And, if you send me the questions, we can discuss. Maybe I can hop on my IG live sometime and try to answer a few of them too. We can talk offline, Tori, about how to figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks again to everyone for joining. This has been recorded, so we'll have it posted online, and I'm going to share some resources. I'll get you some of Jessica's handles for her business and for her personal Instagram so that you can stay connected and kind of follow along to the path of what Uncharted Power has coming in the next couple months with those announcements. Yeah. And then we will be back next Thursday, and we'll be sharing these again online and on YouTube for those who can't join us every day. So thank you again, Jessica, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.